I'm George Galloway, and I present Kalima Horra on Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. Kalima Horra means free word. That's what I speak. So Kalima Horra is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Mayadeen television. Welcome to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television. Coming to you from London, but talking about France. There's a storm blowing outside, Storm Dennis, or Storm Denis, as they might pronounce it in France. But it's nothing like the stormy weather on the streets of Paris. Indeed, throughout France, for more than 1 year, France has been convulsed in social and industrial unrest. Massive general strikes, weekly altercations between the phenomenon that has become known as the Gilets Jaunes, the yellow vests, and the hard men of the security services and forces of President Macron. The proximate cause of the unrest in the beginning was an increase in fuel duties. Then it was the changes to the pension system in France. But both of these were the proximate causes. They were not the fundamental issues. Thus, when President Macron showered euros down the Champs-Élysées, breaking the EU's fiscal rules as he went, and made changes to his highly controversial pension reforms. When I was young, reforms were a good thing. Now they are almost always a bad thing. But the shower of euros has not quelled the uprising. And for 60 weeks and more, the yellow vests have been marching throughout France, usually ending in bloody confrontation with the anti-riot police. What is this phenomenon? Is it a riot? A riot being a firework that goes up in the air spectacularly and comes down as a burned stick? Or is it a, I don't know, dare I call it, a French Revolution? Is it something fundamental that's going on in France, or merely squally weather? Well, the internal ructions in President Macron's own party suggest that something much more serious is going on. Parliamentarians from his own bloc in the National Assembly have now defected. Rats are jumping off a ship that might well be sinking. We're going to look today not just at the surface of this phenomenon, but at its ontology. What is the meaning of? What is the texture, character of this new movement called the Yellow Vests? I'm joined, as always, by an audience of distinguished experts and one or two enthusiastic amateurs like me. Let's see who has the microphone. Sir, kindly introduce yourself and say what you would like about this issue.
Hello, I'm Neil McRae, Senior Lecturer at King's College London, and for me what's going on in France is perhaps the clearest illustration of the polarization between an aloof metropolitan elite with globalist ideals and the ordinary working people who are being punished. They're being punished with higher taxes. They're being punished with all kinds of policies which make their livelihoods harder to sustain. Across the modern Western democracies in the world, we have got the poorer sections of society earning no more relatively than they were 20 years ago. And if anything, that's going to get worse. I think that this movement is something that's not going to go away, the Gilets Jaunes. And I think that we've got a ruling class whose days are numbered.
Professor, do you place this phenomenon then in the same context as the Brexit uprising in Britain, which confounded one might call them the globalizing, liberalizing ruling elite, and overthrew them and voted to leave the European Union. Do you place it in the same context as the rise of what's called populism, usually as a pejorative, though I never quite understood what was wrong with being popular, that propelled Trump, for example, to the White House against the globalizing liberal elite of the Clinton Democratic Party? Do you see it as part of that process?
Well, the interesting thing about this pejorative term populism is that globalists think that everything is going to end up the same everywhere around the world. And in fact, if you look at populist movements, they've all got their distinct national flavours. The Gilets Jaunes in France, Brexit in Britain, the Republican takeover by Donald Trump in the USA, the Arab Spring, for example, in Middle Eastern countries. They've all got a very distinct national flavour. So, I mean, I saw a burgeoning yellow vest movement on the streets of London 2 years ago. It didn't really go anywhere. It just didn't really fit with the British way of doing things. And of course, the police clamped down on it very, very harshly as well. So I think it's interesting to see how the wishes, the desires of the neoliberal globalists to see everything work out the same in this wonderful melting pot. Actually, each culture, each nation has got its own flavour of protest.
From one professor to another. Professor Traoré, let me ask you, you are French, you're just recently returned from there.
Yeah.
Looking at the texture, as I called it, the character of the protest movement in France, one of the things that is said, usually by liberals, is that it's a far-right, all-white working class phenomenon. Is that true from your perspective?
No, and I was a bit disappointed when I was listening to the English news and listening to some of the activists. They were condemning the movement, saying that it was a movement led by some racist groups. In fact, what we've got to understand about the Yellow Vest movement, it is the whole society that is involved. And of course, in the French society, you've got some racists. So, you had also Marine Le Pen, who was trying to hijack the movement. And it was in the interest of the establishment of the government to say, okay, it is a movement of the racists, so that no one wants it. But when you look at the movement and those who started it, who initiated the movement, you will find that they are not racist. So of course you had part of them who were racist, who joined the movement. It means that when France is suffering, when the working class is suffering, everyone is suffering. So no matter if you're white, black, and so on. So I wouldn't say that the movement is a movement that is racist. Of course, those who are suffering the most are the working class. But when you look at it today, it seems that we started with the Yellow Vest movement, but now you've got people demonstrating because of the pension system reform. They are all against it, and all professions are involved. You've got the lawyers. Okay, you've got the
ballet
doctors.
dancers.
Yeah. You've got everyone: doctors, lawyers, teachers at university. So all the different, let's say, professions are affected, because just for people to understand, when you retire at the moment in France, you make something like, let's say, 75 or 80% of the money you used to make when you were working, which means that my dad's generation have. They have a very good pension. So, but we know that for our generation, things are going to be different. And if you want to understand the French society and have an opinion and see what is going to be like, I mean, let's say in 10 or 20 years' time, it's going to be very close to what you've got here in the UK. And the French are not ready for that. So this is why they are protesting. I personally work in one of the universities in Paris that is not a left-wing university. But everyone agrees that what the government is trying to do is not good for their future. So it is the whole society that he is protesting. If you want to, it's funny to look at the situation of France today, because we've got the feeling that we are like in an African country where you've got someone in power, okay, and who is a kind of puppet working for some corporations and going against the will of the people.
Is the character of Macron one of the factors here? He often seems to me, and it's a constant criticism of him, that he behaves more like a Bourbon king than a president. He'd be happier in the Palace of Versailles, where he actually is often to be found, than in the presidential residence. This sense of entitlement, this sense of being rather larger figure historically than I think he'll turn out to be.
Yes, definitely. I think that Macron is totally disconnected with the people, disconnected with the country. So, but it's easy to understand why. If you look at his own life, he is someone who, in fact, rejected his family, because when he married his wife, his parents were against it. So he is not like everyone of us. He's got different feelings, and he's very awkward as well. We saw it, the way he was talking to the people, when you had this young man coming to him saying, okay, I'm looking for a job, but I can't find one. He said, yeah, I'm going to cross the road and find you one, okay? And when we had the Benalla affair, okay, he said to the people who were protesting and asking him, okay, what happened? He said, okay, there's no one is guilty. If you want something, come and get me. So now you've got the French people, the mass, the people of the streets coming and trying to get him.
Sir, what's your take on things?
My name is Said Diria. I come from Somali Institute of International Strategic Study.
Welcome.
And I specialize in the European strategic institutions. I think it is a matter of in following Britain footstep of Brexit. People of France, I think, are more likely to demand and that the European project is over. And I think it's a matter of a time where they would need to be given a choice to actually leave the European project, which is actually failing. And I think because Britain left, it will be a matter of time we're going to see France and Italy and Greece and some other countries will follow. So although it's a popular reform in issue at the moment, maybe a bigger picture is actually something which will show that the European project or European superstate is not working. And I think it will be a very, very short term to actually see the situation change to a more demand of independency, of sovereignty, of similar kind of UK Brexit issue that will happen in France. So I think it's a global issue as well. And you have seen the Arab Spring, you have seen what's happening in the Gulf states, and you have seen what Britain does in the independence of UK leaving out of Europe. So it's actually a global issue. And the globalization is actually started to actually collapse in Europe. And I think what we are watching in France is bigger than reform of pension or jobs or anything like that. We are watching a situation where what you used to call a new world order and globalization and European superstate development is not going to go anywhere, and we're going to go back to independent European states in some time down the line.
Professor McCrae, that would make it very much more important. That would transform it from the firework, the rocket, to being something much more revolutionary, if Professor is correct. To what extent is Frexit going to be a theme, do you think, in 2020?
Well, I believe that all of the scaremongering about Britain leaving the EU, when it becomes quite apparent that Britain is actually standing on its own 2 feet very well and maybe even prospering with Brexit, I think you'll start to see some more independence movements in other EU states, and it could be a surprise. It could be that a country like France, at the very heart of the iron, steel and coal community back in the 1950s, one of the founding members of the whole EU idea, and under Macron, perhaps its most federalist promoter, I think it could well be a country like France, and it could be that the Gilets Jaunes movement at the moment, which has got quite sort of vague ideals, people from left and right, people of all kinds of different demographic backgrounds, and it's not always quite clear exactly what the Gilets Jaunes are protesting for. They don't have a unified message. And I think that a French independence movement could be something that could unify them and make their movement a lot stronger.
The very incoherent nature of their demands, no leaders, no spokesmen, no program, is of course, the upside of that is everyone can join in. You don't have to be this or that.
Well, as you know, George, of the Brexit movement, it actually worked well that we had the Leave.eu campaign and Vote Leave as two separate movements, because the danger of having one movement is you get one figurehead, and once that figurehead is in some way disparaged or vilified in the media, then the whole thing can come crashing down. I mean, this was a problem for Nigel Farage. There was something known as the Farage paradox, where the more popular Nigel Farage was, the lower the opinion polls showing desire to leave the EU. And that's why the Vote Leave campaign, they decided we've got to keep Farage at the margins of this movement, even though Nigel Farage, most people would see him as the one single figure who brought about Brexit. But he's a Marmite figure. You know, people either love him or hate him. And the point that you're making, I do agree with. It's that if you do have a unified movement, you tend to have one leader, and then the whole movement can start to break up because, you know, you get people who disagree with two or three aspects of what that leader is standing for. However, having said that, I do think that the Gilets Jaunes are so vague and diverse. I think if they're going to advance onto the next level, because I think they've been operating roughly at the same level for about a year now. They've done remarkably well at sustaining the movement, but if it's to go to the next stage, I think it needs to have a more unifying message and unifying force.
Professor Trory, to what extent is Frexit beginning to emerge? I begin to see, not on the British media because they don't cover these demonstrations at all, but I seldom watch the British media. But I'm beginning to see more slogans, more flags and so on that seem to point in that direction. And if you would additionally make a comment on this, there are no leaders emerging from the pack on the streets of the yellow vests, or for that matter, the general strikes and so on. So where does that leave the galère of political leaders? Are they defunct? It's one thing to say you're against Macron, but who are you for? Are you for Marie Le Pen? Are you for the figures on the left? Are you for something completely different?
I don't see Frexit happening. I see that most French people want a different form of European Union. The reason why there won't be, in my opinion, no Frexit is because if there is Frexit, this is the end of the European Union. Because we all know that the European Union was, let's say, created by two nations at the time, France and Germany, two main countries, and Germany was occupied. So which means that in this relationship, Germany was in position of weakness, and France was not. France was not divided like Berlin and East Germany and West Germany. So if there is, so which means that, and even when France decided, when we decided in the European Union to integrate East European countries, it was just to better exploit them Okay, and even when we look at the decisions level, if you look at the decision, the most important decisions are taken either by Germany and France. And Germany today has strengths in this union, but it was not planned. And that this was not planned. This was not the objective. The objective was to have France as the strongest element within this union. So, of course, you've got lots of French people who are against the European Union, but when you ask them questions and try to find out, you will see that what they want is a different form of European Union. Maybe with Mélenchon, we don't know, but
Well, where stands Mélenchon on all of this? And where do the people stand in relation to him? If he'd got 3% more in the first ballot last time, it would have been him against Marine Le Pen, and therefore, presumably, him in the Élysée. Why has he not capitalized on this mass upsurge?
I think the media is responsible for it. You know that Macron, he was working with the big corporations, so he's working with the bigger corporations. So there was a plot, in my opinion, which means that the media, they put Marine Le Pen forward in the news. She was in all the news, and there was they kind of boycotted Mélenchon, so that it is, I think even next elections, they're going to try to play the same game again, which means putting Marine Le Pen forward, so that, in fact, when you've got Marine Le Pen and Macron, people think, okay, it's better to have Macron.
That might be more risky this time than it was last time.
This time, yeah. But this is why, in fact, I was saying that there's a link, or we could make a parallel with what's happening in some African countries, which means that this is a real revolution in the sense that we French people want to change the system. If you look at this kind of movement, it started with social media, okay, and also because it is a technique that some politicians are using, and to deprive the people from from democracy. So it is a real revolution that is going on.
Much more of this after the break. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen Television, coming from London, but talking about France and the tumultuous events of the last 60 weeks or so. We took the Kalima Horra camera onto the streets of London to see what the people thought. Let's take a look.
Who are France's Yellow Vest protesters and what do they want?
Well, they're a movement in France, a radical movement, and they've been protesting for a year or so now, and I'm not quite sure what it is that they want, to be honest, but I think it all started off when they wanted to reduce fuel prices.
From my understanding, the France Yellow Vesters are people who want pensions, want equality in their pensions.
When they were raising the prices for fuels, and because they were fighting against Macron because he was supposedly having a policy for the rich people, and so they protest against that, but then they didn't have like a common goal, and yeah, it kind of was a bit messy.
As far as I know, at the moment, I think they're protesting against the reduction of their pensions. That's the main protest at the moment. That's all I know.
So actually, like, the Gilets Jaunes started as a protest against inequality in France, against Macron's decision of lowering taxes to great fortunes in France, and at the same time increasing taxation on l'essence, fossil fuels, and then they have actually led to a situation in which they're mostly protesting against the general inequalities in the French society and against the flaws of this capitalist system that's leading to increasing levels of inequality, poverty, and social injustice within France. They're also very much focused on targeting Macron as a president.
Are the protests a sign of end to the Macron era?
I'm not sure about that. It would be amazing if it would be an end of an era, but I think the government really, I think they can handle the movement.
It might be too soon to tell. I don't know.
I hope so. I hope so, yeah.
No, I don't think so. I think, they just they got less and less supporters, right? So I don't think it's gonna last.
I think they definitely pose a challenge to Macron's leadership. I think his popularity has decreased since the Gilets Jaunes began to take to the streets. I'm not entirely sure they will be putting an end to Macron's era because he still remains as a popular leader.
Well, the original French revolutionaries were sans culottes. They had no shirts. Today's have, and they're yellow. That's just one of the differences. Perhaps the other is that the original French revolutionaries succeeded in overthrowing the power of the day. There seems to be mixed feelings on the streets of London as to whether these revolutionaries can do the job. Where do you stand on it, sir?
I mean, I think what's clear from looking at what the people said in London is that there are so many different elements as to the protest. You know, some are talking about fuel, some are talking about pensions, some are just talking about inequality in general. And I think, as was said in the first half, you know, for a movement that has sort of no distinguishable leaders to gain such traction over there, and at one point in the run-up to the European elections last year, for that movement with no clear aims, goals, leaders, to be actually reaching double digits in French opinion polls, I think shows that the French are looking for something very different, almost a sort of none of the above, we want it all changed. And I think that's quite remarkable to see. I think that, unfortunately, with the way the French voting system works, if the media do pitch it again as a Macron-Le Pen, whether or not it ends the Macron era is very uncertain. But already you can see, you know, we're still some time off from the next French presidential election. But in recent opinion polls, you'll see Macron standing at around about 55% in a second round in a runoff against Le Pen at around 45%, which already is a far narrower margin.
Massively, yes.
Than Macron won by against Le Pen the last time round. And I think that shows that the French people are looking for something that isn't Macron and are willing almost to hold their nose and to vote for something which, you know, historically will have had quite a low ceiling of support, you know, the Front National or Rassemblement.
Well, Chirac defeated her father, the original Le Pen, by at least 80-20.
Oh, yeah, it was.
Because only the fascists would vote for her father.
Absolutely.
She's closed the gap quite a distance. She's tried to clean up the party's image, deal with some of its historical baggage. That's why I say it would be very risky to promote her as the alternative candidate, because she might win.
Certainly, and, you know, changing the party's name to, you know, the Rassemblement National is a further way of sort of detoxifying the party. You know, it will either be Macron versus Le Pen or Macron versus Mélenchon. There's no, you know, other at the moment viable third option to go against Macron. But, you know, he's already one of the most unpopular French presidents. I think only worse in this point in his presidency is President François Hollande. And so you
Who ended up with, his party ended up with 6% of the vote.
Yes, quite. So you could even end up with a situation by the time the next elections come round, where by the second round you're not even looking at Macron being one of the final two. I think it just depends whether or not the movement can be sustained, whether or not they do formalise and a ringleader sort of does develop and they formalise and take themselves forward. Because I think if they did, there's a very real chance that in France in the future, the next election, they could well play a very major force. As I say, already in polls in the last year, this non-party has emerged bigger than the Socialist Party, which, as you say, was in power for some time in France and was a major force, yet now are nothing.
It was in the presidency just a couple of years ago.
Well, exactly, yes.
And now it's had to move out of its headquarters because it can't pay its rent.
And I think that shows just how much and how quickly French politics is shifting. And as for in the Vox Pop, they're saying it's this sort of radical movement. We've already seen sort of on the right would have been outside that Overton window as radical of Le Pen and those there, as all of a sudden become more mainstream. And equally on the left, the Gilets Jaunes movement against those movements by Macron, again, is becoming acceptable to the point where they're at double digits in the polls already. Imagine what could happen if they organised themselves.
Sir, in the middle row.
So I just wanted to make two quick contributions. One on this idea that the Yellow Vest movement will contribute towards Frexit. Almost all the most recent opinion polls on satisfaction and pro-Europeanness suggest a rise in pro-Europeanness rather than the reverse. So surely what we're going to see is an expression outside of the European framework. We're going to see it in a more national politics sphere. And the second point I'd like to make is that there are examples of what's happening in France happening elsewhere in Europe. So in Italy, we see the rise of Lega and Salvini. In Spain, we see the rise of Vox. We see the rise of the AfD in Germany. And so this alternative right, far right rise in national politics is exemplifiable elsewhere. But whether it can break through the ceiling in France, as it hasn't been able to so far in the other countries, remains to be seen. And I'm not sure how much the Yellow Vest movement will push that.
Do you place this phenomenon with the likes of Vox rather than, as I portrayed it, as a broadly based working class movement?
The Yellow Vest movement less so. So that's definitely more in tune with the Sardine movement in Italy, whereas the push for Marine Le Pen and the National Front is much more in line with those other rises in
Sure. And how do you say that Frexit will not be an issue? And I admit my evidence is purely anecdotal from my eyes, and I appreciate these protesters are merely a segment of French opinion. But if you look at the issues that fueled Brexit in Britain, those issues very definitely exist in France. The issue of freedom of movement, the issue of immigration, the issue of refugee flows, the issue of a cultural stand being made for Frenchness, for Britishness, for difference, as opposed to the blending process that the European Union is seen to be by many people in many countries.
Well, I disagree with the idea that those are the primary drivers for Brexit. I much more refer to the austerity that has ravaged Britain for 6 years leading up to Brexit, and then another 3 or 4 years on top of that. You see the same with what's happening with Emmanuel Macron, because Emmanuel Macron is bringing in a programme of austerity, and that may then reflect in a Frexit idea, but actually I think it's much more reflected in this polarisation of national politics than it is in any concept of Frexit.
Professor?
Yes. What I think we've got to understand is that the European Union is a French possession. Okay, they possess it. So this is why, in fact, having Frexit for me is going to be more difficult. I repeat it, the reason why we integrated many East European countries within the European Union is because we wanted to exploit them and weaken the Soviet Union. But the way the European Union was planned, this is a French possession. They thought that they were going to be the strongest element, that Germany was divided, yes, of course, and was occupied as well. So, but unfortunately, what happened? You had the reunification of Germany. You had the German industries as well, very performance. So this is when, in fact, France started to lose a bit. But for many people, even if you listen to Macron, he said that we should think about doing things differently within the European Union, and he was very clear. It was very clear in the French news that only few countries would, in the new conception, will take the decisions, the most important decisions. Which are these few countries? France, Germany, okay? Because Britain is not.
But Macron posed as Mr. Europe. He intended to be the Tsar of Europe. Mrs. Merkel was clearly coming to the end of her time. She's quite infirm in some regards and politically not as stable as before. The idea was that this French possession, which is how you describe the EU, would be led by a man who would take France's influence still farther, still deeper.
Okay, I'm going to take another example to demonstrate it. If you look at what France is doing in some African countries like Mali, okay, trying to recolonize. So now you've got Africans saying that we don't want, that they don't want this African currency, which is le franc CFA. So the technique of Macron is saying, okay, we are going to create a new currency with a new name, but just the name is changing. And if in the past this currency was pegged with the French currency, or France was deciding, they've decided now to include the European currency, okay, l'euro. So that is the technique. So using the European Union, sometimes that is going to give more strength to France to go and do what they've planned with some African countries, like le G5. Okay, the military that the French are sending to places like Mali, they don't have the money. We don't have the money in France. We don't have the men. We don't. So we organize this, and then we say, okay, Germany, come and join us. So that
I'm not sure how keen Germany will be on that. On that point, sir, what about France's? I mean, Britain has a pretty sordid imperial history. France's is no better. I suppose one difference is we're not re-invading Africa and seeking to reshape it, whilst France is.
Yes, and that's interesting what the professor just say about the franc in currency or franc. In actually, there was one French left using in franc, and that actually cut off its colony or colonial route in Africa, because like country like Djibouti or Djibouti, they're still using franc as a currency. So the changes is that, as we know, France as a colonial to Africa like Britain or Empire, and the situation has changed, and it seems that people of France would like to come back to their currency, their own money, their own sovereignty, and like they want to recreate the empire that they used to have, like Britain is doing right now. We just have seen in the 20th of January, Britain calling all Africa to reunite under the Commonwealth, and UK African Investment Summit was happening here in London. So the actual situation is changing to that direction, not to European superstate that France was thinking when it has created the project with the Germans. So I think one of the setbacks for the project of the European superstate is that Britain was a major contributory to the economy of Europe. So Britain left, so who is left then? It's going to be Germany and France. France cannot afford to actually...
Well, neither can Germany. They're on the edge of recession.
Yes.
In fact, they're in industrial recession.
Yes.
And the patience of the German taxpayer to be the handout king of the European Union is surely waning fast.
Yes. Yeah, actually, because of that, the situation, you could see it that they cannot afford to subsidize other countries, including France. But the chairman cannot do that. In Spain, Italy, Greece, the situation is actually has no future to actually continue to that project. So I think it is a matter of France people getting the opportunity to leave Europe or not, like David Cameron give to UK citizens. So it's a matter of that. Actually, we are watching a time where we will see France people requesting in what you call referendum to actually opt out.
Well, Professor McRae, President Macron himself said that if there was a referendum in France, the French people would vote to leave the European Union, which is why, he said with remarkable candor, we're not going to give them such a referendum. Of course, there was a time when the British had no intention of having an in-out referendum, and look how that turned out.
Yes, well, I think that Macron is seen as a neo-Napoleonic figure who wants to be at the head of this European superstate. He's very much in favour of the EU army. The gentleman behind me was quite pessimistic, I think, about the chances of France, the French deciding to leave the EU, or maybe optimistic. I don't know what your opinion on that was, but I can see that it does seem unrealistic that France would leave the EU. But consider this. Let's say there's an EU army and there's a riot in Barcelona. The Catalans...
Sounds quite likely on both counts.
The Catalans have decided that they want to break away from Spain. The EU army gets sent in. And who's going to get blamed for that? The neo-Napoleonic figure that has been the arch-federalist, superstatist who wanted to bring about this EU army in the first place. And almost Macron, you can imagine him being seen as at the head of this army, which is going into EU member states to put down rebellions. And I think that sort of thing, if that happens, then attitudes towards the EU will change very fast.
Sir, you demurred at that. Say why, please.
So the idea that an army would be called in to put down civil unrest goes against almost every single European norm in almost every single European country. So I think
why
the idea,
create a European army then, if not for that?
it's for common defence purposes. So it's for external use rather than internal use. That's what traditionally armies are meant for, even if they're not always used that way. And Europe has traditionally followed that model. So the idea that a united European army would be used to suppress European citizens is unlikely. What is more likely is a united European police force would do that. But police is devolved even within the current European framework, so it's unlikely for that to... So I disagree with the premise.
Existential danger exists in Spain and could exist, did exist briefly in Italy, but very definitely exists in Spain. If the people of Catalonia decide that they're going to have to make a stand, it's not certain that the Spanish state itself possesses the power to stop an illegal act of secession. And therefore it's not fanciful that the Spanish government would ask the EU for assistance.
Mm-hmm. But if you look at the recent troubles in Catalonia, you can see that it was Catalan police, with the aid of some certain small police forces outside of Catalan, that suppressed that secessionist movement, not the police or the military of the Spanish
But if it
state.
got bigger and stronger and more dangerous...
Hypothetically, but I mean, even within that context, I can never see the European army being used against...
I have a question as to who this European army is supposed to fight. I mean, is it going to fight Russia? Is that the point? Is it going to repel the United States Marines? Is that the point? What is the point of a European army when all these European countries are in NATO?
Yeah. I mean, what's the point of an army of a national country anyway? within our current framework, it's not being used.
But we're all in NATO.
We are.
We're now being asked, well, we're out of it, but the Europeans are now being asked to have their army in NATO and in a European army. You don't see a paradox there?
No, not within that.
All right, changing the subject to you first, if I may, then I'll go around, along the front bench. The next French presidential elections, will Macron prevail, do you think?
I hope he doesn't get into the second round. But I also hope Marine Le Pen doesn't get into the second round. Jean-Luc Mélenchon is definitely probably the most ideal candidate to win the next election, I would hope, personally.
Let's ask the young man, Britain's youngest parliamentary candidate. You're a young man, but he's younger.
I think if the polls continue on their current trajectory, then Macron won't be in power come the next French presidential election. But I think the French will have a hard time in sort of holding their nose and voting for Le Pen if it is that conventional runoff that we're expecting to see. And so I think it's all in flux. I think if the Gilets Jaunes movement can continue with the momentum they've got, then there's every chance Macron won't be in power come the next election.
Professor, could someone whose name we don't know yet, or we don't, maybe you do, I mean, why wouldn't Le Pen put up a more palatable candidate, for example, for the newly renamed party that she leads? Might the Socialist Party throw its lot in with Mélenchon, at least not run a serious campaign against him so as to boost his chances of being in the runoff? Tell us if there are any, as it were, left field solutions to this that we have not yet considered.
I think at this stage, anything can happen. And even if you've got 2 years left, that's too long to try to foresee what's going to happen. Regarding Marine Le Pen, I think she won't be president. Maybe her niece could be president because she's young and lots of people.
Tell us about her niece. They like to keep it in the family these days.
Yes, yeah, and this is the reason why Marine Le Pen is not going to be elected, because some people see it as a family affair. Her dad was in politics, she's in politics. So sometimes, and she's not, in my opinion, that's just me, but she's not very clever. That's my opinion. And we saw it in the last campaign, a political campaign, when she was facing Macron in the debate. She was very weak. So I think this is the reason why she won't be elected. Her niece is young. She decided to stop politics for a while. So which means that she's not that much interested in politics. She's trying to have another career. She's very educated as well. So not like her aunt.
When you say young, how young? What's her name?
She's in her early 30s, and Marion Maréchal. That's her name, Marion Maréchal. And so
that might help that it's not Le Pen.
Yes, and she's open as well. She's open. She's open to have discussion with ethnic minorities. We see her sometimes communicating and with using the social media. Okay, so she's not like Marine Le Pen. Marine Le Pen, everyone knows that she's racist. There's no doubt on that. And does she really care about the people? Because, sometimes you've got people who are racist and pretend to work for the working class. But we know that, in fact, regarding the economy of the country, they've got the same views as Macron, not far from this. It's like just capitalism. Okay, so we've got to be careful with all this.
Professor, last word to you. This is as much about the culture wars. This culture war is redefining what it means to be left and what it means to be right, is it not?
Well, I no longer use the terms. I prefer the conceptualization of David Goodhart, the somewheres and anywheres. So the Gilets Jaunes would be very much the somewheres. They're people from all across France, provincial voters, people who have been punished with these higher taxes for this so-called climate crisis and so on, and being punished by these globalist ideals and policies of Macron and his ilk. Macron is an anywhere. And I think that what I find with my students, who are largely middle-class, sort of privileged backgrounds, they quite openly admit to being anywheres. They're post-nation. They don't believe the nation-state has any real purpose or function anymore. And what they don't realize, those people, is they're losing, and they're losing very badly. And we see that in America, we see it in Brazil, we see it with Brexit, we're seeing it with the Gilets Jaunes. The Gilets Jaunes are mostly people who have a sense of belonging. They believe that they're French, and that doesn't matter what color they are or what, their demographic status. They're French. They're very strongly French, as well as the yellow vest. You'll see them bearing the tricolour as well. They are somewheres, and that is where I see the divide today. It's patriots versus globalists, patriots versus neoliberal, callous, capitalist, post-nation people who have got no caring anymore for the ordinary people who built their countries.
Well, it's been fascinating. What the answer to the question is, I don't yet know. I suppose we'll have to wait for the next French presidential elections to come along, unless there's a revolution between now and then. It's been marvellous. I hope it was for you. This is George Galloway for Kalima Horra on Mayadeen Television.